Welcome everyone to the NCSS C3 Collaborative Literacy Professional Development Webinar, C3 Framework Dimension 2, Applying Disciplinary Concepts and Tools. A big thank you to our partners in this effort, the National Center for Literacy in Education, and to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding and making this project possible. My name is Anna Post, and I'm the Director of External Relations and Council Communications at NCSS, as well as this grant's project coordinator. The goal of this initiative is to create and operationalize a plan designed specifically for social studies teachers to implement the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts by utilizing the C3 framework. This webinar is produced in conjunction with an in-depth investigation. Information on how the full investigation can be accessed by C3LC project teacher groups and non-project participants at the Literacy and Learning Exchange site and at the NCSS website will be provided at the end of the webinar. We are so pleased to have Dr. Wayne Journell as the moderator of tonight's panel of content experts. Dr. Journell is the Associate Editor for Theory and Research in Social Studies Education. His research interests include political science, current events and culturally responsive pedagogy, as well as online education. Dr. Journell and panelists, it is a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Let me now turn the microphone over to Dr. Journell so that we can begin tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Anna. Good evening, and welcome to the latest professional development webinar for the College, Career, and Civic Life Framework, hosted by the National Council for the Social Studies. As Anna said, my name is Wayne Journell, and I'm an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and I'll be the moderator for this session. Tonight we're going to be focusing on Dimension 2 of the C3 framework, which describes ways in which students should be able to apply concepts and tools related to the four core disciplines that comprise social studies education: civics, economics, geography, and history. As you're hopefully aware, the C3 framework seeks to move social studies education beyond the memorization of dates, facts, and locations on a map. Rather, the C3 encourages students to engage in practices of critical inquiry within each of these representative disciplines. The focus of tonight's webinar, then, will be what does critical inquiry look like in these disciplines and how teachers can create lessons that allow students to engage in disciplinary inquiry. We're fortunate enough to have with us 4 disciplinary experts who will help facilitate these discussions. For civics, we will hear from Peter Levine, the Associate Dean for Research at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Citizenship and Public Service at Tufts University, and former Director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. For economics, we'll hear from Phil Van Fossen, James F. Ackerman Professor of Social Studies Education and Chair of the Department of Curriculum Instruction at Purdue University. For geography, we have Jim Houff, a social studies teacher at Berkeley Middle School in Berkeley, Missouri, who is also a member of the Missouri Geographic Alliance and an editorial board member of the journal The Geography Teacher. Finally, for history, we have Elaine Carey, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History at St. John's University and current Vice President for the Teaching Division of the American Historical Association. Each of them will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll end with a general question and answer session. So a couple quick technical items before we begin. As you are listening to each of the speakers, feel free to type questions or comments into the chat box. I'll be monitoring it, and we may return to those questions at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Peter Levine, who will discuss disciplinary inquiry in civics.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Wayne, for the intro, and to see the names of some people I know and some friends, and to meet other people. I'm going to talk briefly about civics. I doubt that I need 10 minutes, but I'm looking forward to some conversation at the end. And so we're looking at disciplinary, at applying disciplinary concepts, and that's a little trickier for civics, I would say, than for any of the other disciplines, because if you looked in a college catalog, you would find a Department of History, a Department of Geography, a Department of Economics, and not economics education, though that's very important and was also taught by the Department of Economics, and it would include a PhD program, and in addition to the PhD program, we'd have journals and Nobel Prize in economics. Civics isn't in the college curriculum, not as such. So one immediate question is, what are we talking about here? Are we talking basically about political science? Some would say so, but I wouldn't. Actually, I don't think high school and middle school and elementary kids should be thinking of themselves as studying political science. I actually think that's too narrow. law, same for law. I don't think, although constitutional law is relevant, and some understanding of law, what used to be called law-related education is relevant. I don't think we're teaching them a little bit of law. One view would be that the whole of the liberal arts is supposed to be civic education or civics. So then, you know, in the high school curriculum, English, history, math, chemistry would all be civics because they're all preparation for citizenship. And that's true, but there's got to be something specific under civics. And certainly the C3 standards have a bunch of specific standards, or framework has a bunch of specific standards for civics. So what is it? I think the way to get into that conversation is actually to ask what good citizens do. So it's to ask what civic engagement is, to look at the outcome. And then to backtrack and ask what disciplinary material you need to master, or at least to address, in order to be ready for that. So pulling two quotes out of the C3 document, civic engagement for us as authors of the C3 work meant to address public problems individually and collaboratively. It doesn't say to solve public problems, because a lot of problems really are hard to solve, but to do something about them, both as an individual, so, you know, making good choices as an individual to make public problems less bad, but also collaboratively, so a lot about how to work with other people. And another quote, to maintain, strengthen, and improve communities and societies. So if we're thinking about a community as small as the neighborhood or as big as the world, and certainly including the United States of America as a republic, our job is to maintain it, to keep it. So the republic won't survive without our maintenance, but not just to leave it alone, to strengthen and improve it. So if you ask those questions, and we can debate all this, and I'm sure there are different views, but if we think that civic engagement is the outcome, then the question is, what does someone who is civically engaged need to know? What do you have to study? And certainly some of what you need to know is experiential, but and experience comes into the civics curriculum. But when we think about it in disciplinary terms, well, I think you have to, there's two big bullets here. You have to understand how to use the government as a tool for making communities better, for addressing public problems. The government is a tool, and a very important one. And so that leads to some pieces of what would be a college or even postgraduate discipline, constitutional law, but I should have also listed here political science, in the sense of understanding how the government works, understanding the limits on government, understanding different forms of government. But there's a second bullet there, which is how to use other appropriate means to make the community better and to preserve the republic. Because the government is not the only means. We also work in civil society, we work with peers, we work with neighbors, we work in voluntary contexts, we work with the media. So you really have to draw on other disciplines, including political science, sociology, international relations, because we're working now in a global world, ethics, because you need to make the world better, not just change the world for the better, and that raises the question of what's better, what are good means, and what are good ends. So if civics is a discipline, it draws on all of these things, and I think it is a discipline, not one which has a good enough space in the college curriculum. We're working on that at the college level, but one which has really been part of the high school curriculum for 100 years, and I would say those are the outlines of it. So Wayne, I think I can turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Peter. And at this time, we'll turn it over to Phil Van Falsen, who will talk about inquiry in economics.
Those are the outlines of it.
All right, thank you, Peter. And at this time, we'll turn it over to Phil Van Falsen, who will talk about inquiry in economics.
Thanks, Wayne, and welcome the opportunity to discuss something that I'm very passionate about, obviously economic literacy. And unfortunately, economics is often got short shrift and is misunderstood as the dismal science, which I'm sure many of our participants will be aware of. The quote itself refers not to the nature of the discipline, but really its dismal prediction that the world will always be strained against limited natural resources. So in The economics course that I teach for undergraduates, Econ 219, every semester I start by asking the question, what is economics the study of? And their answers often include things like the stock market, banks and banking, business, the government, money, jobs, supply and demand. And if I'm lucky, I'll get monetary policy, inflation, GDP, etc. But regardless of how long the list that the students generate is, their answers are misguided too. I tell them economics is as much a study of human behavior as anthropology or psychology or sociology. In fact, several recent winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics, which Peter mentioned a moment ago, have been experimental psychologists, notably Daniel Kahneman and Vernon Smith most recently. So this broader sense of the discipline, I think, is seen in Smith most recently. So this broader sense of the discipline, I think, is seen in this quote by Alfred Marshall, the British economist. He said that economics is the study of mankind in the everyday business of life. Thus, it's one side a study of wealth, and on the other side, the more important side, the study of man. And I think it's important to note that this goes back to, this quote actually goes to 1890. So this is an idea that's been around for a while. So one of the things to think about here is, why is economics important? And another Nobel laureate, James Tobin from Yale, has this quote up, which I think describes it well. And he says that high school graduates will be making economic choices all their lives as breadwinners and consumers and as citizens and voters. So they need some capacity for critical judgment. They'll need it whether or not they go to college. So the importance of economics in the K-12 curriculum, I think, is explained here. So what is economics? Again, it's not something new. In fact, the ancient Greeks had something they called economos, which is the study of one who manages a household, the study of decisions made by that household. And so the idea of economics has been around for quite a while. And I think Bob Ranke, an economist himself, noted this description: economic principles help describe why people do what they do in order to get what they want. And so this notion of, again, study of human behavior is essential to the field. Again, continuing thinking about economics in the K-12 curriculum, I think some would argue that it might be the most relevant course that high school students ever take. Not because of the focus on supply and demand, but in fact because of this idea of the study of human behavior, and it gives them a chance to think about ways to address an economic way of thinking and really to analyze any decision that they might encounter in life. So it's more than just supply and demand, in fact. And in my class, the economics course I referred to, this is the definition that we agree on, that economics is really the science of decision making. So the notion of inquiry and the tools of inquiry are very central to economics as a discipline. In fact, the goal really here is to impress upon students some sort of way to describe decision making and choices in a world of scarce resources. Certainly something that young people face on a daily basis. The decisions they make, economic or otherwise, can be analyzed using an economic way of thinking. So this is a framework for articulating complex relationships and social issues as well, this idea of an economic way of thinking. That is manifest in many ways in economic education, called the Handy-Dandy Guide to Solving Economic Mysteries, which has been around for a while. It's also evident in Greg Mankiw's 10 Principles of Economics. Mankiw is a Harvard professor and also former chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Taken in that context, along with the work of economist Paul Hayne, who has written a text called An Economic Way of Thinking, these combine into kind of 11 tenets that undergird this economic way of thinking. So the first of which is that people face trade-offs, that there are scarce resources, and because we can't have everything, excuse me, that we want, we have to make choices. Secondly, people economize, that they are trying to get the most they can using the scarce resources that they have. The third of these tenets then is all choices involve costs. Some of these are price costs, but not all of them. Opportunity cost, or as Ranke said, what we give up to what we get in order to get what we want. Those are also costs that we need to consider. Fourth on the list is that the consequences of choices lie in the future. that the decisions we make today will have consequences that are unforeseen at this particular juncture. Next on the list of these 11 tenets are that rational decisions occur at the margin. This is not the margin on the edge of a piece of paper, but rather incremental decision making, that we rarely make all or nothing decisions. Really, it's a trade-off, a little bit of this for a little bit of that. If you hit the snooze button on your alarm clock this morning, you've made a marginal decision. The next is that people respond to incentives, and what's more important is that they respond to incentives in predictable ways. And that goes right into the next tenet, which is that prices are extremely powerful incentives, so that when prices change in markets, people respond in predictable ways, whether that's at a micro level or at a macro level. Next on our list is voluntary trade creates wealth, and this is that when individuals give up something they value less, trade with someone for something that they value more, wealth is created, both parties are better off. Mutually beneficial trade benefits all. The next tenet on our list is that markets are a place to facilitate this exchange and to, as a result, increase individual freedom. The system of markets allows for those powerful incentives, particularly pricing, to be put into play and to respond accordingly. Next on the list is governments can sometimes improve market outcomes, and this is the idea that there is a role for government in the economy when there is a free rider problem, when there are property rights issues, when there are spillovers or externalities. This is a place where government can, in fact, step in and improve market outcomes. And last on the list is that standards of living depend on the ability to produce goods and services. So productivity is very important in terms of standard of living. So the ability to produce is related to those issues. So those 11 tenets could comprise an economic way of thinking, this notion of economics as a science of decision making. So how does that relate to the C3 and particularly Dimension 2? If you look at the four elements, the four pathways in C3 Dimension 2, the first of these is economic decision making. So clearly that's very appropriate and relates very closely. The second, exchange and markets, also related to several of those tenets. The third pathway is the national economy, and the fourth is the global economy. So if we look at the C3 Dimension 2 pathways, all right, so here's the first one, economic decision making. And I'm going to focus on grade 12 because usually the high school economics course takes place in grade 12, and so for purposes of time, we'll just look at these. If you look closely here, this first one is analyze how. So if we look at the C3 Dimension 2 pathways, all right, so here's the first one, economic decision making. And I'm going to focus on grade 12 because usually the high school economics course takes place in grade 12, and so for purposes of time, we'll just look at these. If you look closely here, this first one is analyze how incentives influence choices and they result in policies with the range cost benefits for different groups. And the second is use marginal benefits and marginal costs to construct an argument for or against an approach or solution to an economic issue. So if we think back to those 11 tenets there, I think it's very easy to see that at least 3 or 4 of those, I can get my slide to advance here. Oh. There we go. At least three or four of those tenets that we looked at, people respond to incentives, all choices involve cost, rational decisions occur at the margin. These are present here. So there's a nice overlap here, an alignment of the economic way of thinking with the first of the 4 pathways. And I think for let's see. Okay. Anna's telling me that she's made me the host, so I should be able to move it along here. Oh, there we go. So here's the second dimension, exchange and markets. And for purposes of time, I'm not going to go through these, but if we can move that, advance that. Yep, there we go. So 3 more. And here is, again, 3 more of the tenets from an economic way of thinking are reflected in this particular pathway. And on to the next one, there we go, which is the national economy. And we've got at least 3 of the tenets from an economic way of thinking reflected here in the benchmarks for the end of grade 12. There we go. And then the last one, which is the global economy. Only 2 benchmarks here, but again, we see a nice overlap, I think, with the tenets of an economic way of thinking. Right, so voluntary trade creates wealth, markets facilitate exchange and increase individual freedom, and standards of living depend on the ability to produce goods and services. So I think there's nice overlap between sort of the overall goal of economics in terms of an economic way of thinking and this the C3 Dimension 2, particularly the 4 pathways that we have in the framework here. So, okay. What about tools of an economic way of thinking then? So what is it about economic analysis that can help in terms of the inquiry arc and in terms of that economic way of thinking? Obviously, decision tools are important. In economics, decision trees, decision grids, the so-called PACE model is very commonly used. I tell my students that this PACED acronym is a way of sort of visualizing the economic decision-making process, the process of analyzing decisions, weighing costs and benefits, and evaluating those and making decisions. Also, of course, basic supply and demand analysis is also a key part of the tools for an economic way of thinking. Supply and demand graphs are part of economic analysis. I had a professor once who told me, and I agree, that 85% of all market analysis can be done with a simple supply and demand graph. So if you can master that, you can really apply a lot of the tools of the discipline to those kinds of decisions. So, continuing on with tools of an economic way of thinking, obviously economics is a model-driven discipline. Certainly simplified versions of reality with the assumption that we're holding certain variables constant, ceteris paribus, or all other things equal. It's also a discipline that engages in relative comparisons relative to what my alternatives are, what's the best path for me or for others or for society. Additionally, other tools that we use in this discipline of economics are indices, so things like the consumer price index, etc. Clearly ways of measuring change over time, particularly percent change. Very important one in economics is the idea of real versus nominal. We talked about those prices being real incentives that people respond to in predictable ways. So the idea of constant prices is very important. I'll give you a very quick example. If you look at the top 3 grossing movies of all time, they're all from the 2000s and late 1990s, early 2000s. Avatar, Titanic, and excuse me, Marvel, the Avengers. But if we adjust for the price of tickets over time, right, if we put them in real terms and not nominal terms, then Avatar drops to number 5, and Titanic is number 14, and the Avengers is number 27. And the highest grossing film of all time in real terms goes back to 1939, Gone with the Wind. So very important to understand the difference between real and nominal prices in terms of an economic way of thinking. So last thing I'll talk about is quickly how this inquiry works in economics. The idea of the inquiry arc is very important in C3, coming up with compelling questions, something we've done in economics for quite some time. The idea of economic mysteries is a very common approach, so I've put out a few here for example purposes. So why do athletes who play a child's game make millions of dollars, and why some economists might say that they're actually underpaid? If trade is such a good thing, why are so many Americans opposed to it? Another example is why were American bison nearly killed to extinction at one point, but beef cattle and dairy cows thrived? And then quickly, a couple more, if we can get that. Yeah, so if poor people exist, why not just print more money? Question I get in class a lot. If education is so vital, why do teachers appear to make so little? Something important to all of us in this session. And then finally, why do U.S. consumers who are very price conscious buy brand name products opposed to store brands? So sorry about the slowness of the slides, but hopefully I've given you a sense of how the discipline of economics approaches the inquiry arc and how it aligns with and I think overlaps nicely with the C3 Dimension 2. So all right. So thanks, Wayne.
Kind of attests to the fact that geography is not just an academic skill, really it's a life skill. Being able to find one's location, one's place in the world, literally and not just figuratively, is an important characteristic for success in college, career, and civic life. We're looking here at the second edition of Geography for Life, which came out in 2012. The first edition was released in 1994. It's important to note that the rising interest that we have now in inquiry into social studies that's associated with the C3 framework really is a kind of a second coming of inquiry. It rose to prominence the first time in the 1960s and 70s as part of what became known as the new social studies movement. So it's no surprise that the people who wrote the first edition, Geography for Life, were influenced by that earlier era of inquiry in geography, and so it was reflected in Geography for Life. But like a lot of these disciplinary standards that came out in the early 1990s, people paid more attention to the content standards initially than they did to the process standards, the process of inquiry, the skills that were involved. Fortunately, in 2012, when the revised version came out, inquiry was placed at the center of the standards document and really at the center of the process of learning geography. So this means that the National Geography Standards and C3 framework are highly compatible in this regard of being focused on inquiry. Moreover, there's a lot of geography in the C3 framework. Although it's not a content guideline, I count over 120 different geographic concepts and skills that are mentioned in the framework document. Now, that means it's eminently possible to use the C3 framework and its inquiry arc to teach geography in an effective way. All right, so learning geography means doing geography. This was a key premise of that first wave of inquiry into social studies in the 1960s, the idea that in order for students to learn geography, or any other social studies discipline for that matter, they really needed to engage as closely as possible in the types of questioning, thinking, and in the types of tasks that working professionals in that discipline were engaged in. So, and naturally, with anything that people do, the more students practice doing geography, the better they'll get at it. That is, the more geography they'll learn. So there are three main aspects to geographic inquiry. We have the perspectives, content knowledge, and skill. You need all three to do geography, that is, to learn geography effectively. What we're talking about here when we're really asking students, sorry about that, what we're talking about here when we're talking about asking students to engage in thinking about geographic perspectives and knowledge and skills is disciplinary literacy. This is what happens when you go beyond mere content knowledge. Now, geography has frequently been cited as the discipline to illustrate the deficiencies in the United States educational system, to highlight the shortcomings of American education, or to contrast American test results and scores with those of students in other countries. And people decry the inability of American students to locate Afghanistan or the United States or their own city on a map. And this is all fine. That type of content knowledge is important, but really the ability to list place names alone does not constitute disciplinary literacy in geography any more than being able to recite the preamble of the U.S. Constitution would constitute disciplinary literacy in civics. Rather, because learning geography requires doing geography, what we really mean is that students need to learn how to engage effectively in the process of geographic inquiry. I have to say that training students to think from a disciplinary perspective is going to be very difficult. And in fact, I think challenging them to do that from each of the perspectives of the four core social studies disciplines is going to be one of the main challenges facing us as we try and implement the C3 framework and its inquiry arc. Now, of the three elements here in geographic inquiry, I suspect that those who are participants here probably are most familiar, all to some extent, with the content knowledge that might comprise geography. So I'm going to focus today on the perspectives and on some of the skills. There are two different, distinctly different geographic perspectives that we want students to be able to understand and apply. One of these is the spatial perspective, the sense of awareness. Where are things? Where is something? Why is it there? And why does that matter? So these elements of space and place. A lot of times, spatial context can help us understand what motivates, in part, people to do the things that they do. Why does somebody want to take control of a particular area? What resources are available there? What type of contact have they had with other people in that area? So the spatial perspective helps us to understand those issues, or helps students to understand them. The second perspective is the ecological perspective. This really focuses in the way that humans interact with other elements of the earth, both living and non-living. How do humans modify the environment? How do they use it? How do they adapt to it? These are reciprocal influences. They vary by scale. What happens on a small scale may have different effects from something happening on a large scale, and those interactions will vary over time. These also sometimes can help us understand motivations for human behavior, the types of interactions that people are having with their physical environments. Now, I'm going to try and do a little bit of what Philip did here and look at some of the different pathways or subcategories in Dimension 2 on geography, and try and think about how those relate to the two perspectives of geography that we just looked at. So first of all, we have geographic representation, spatial views of the world. The spatial perspective obviously is central here. We're talking about, sorry about that. We're talking about space, describing the world in terms of location, of distance, of direction, patterns, shapes, arrangements. We want to analyze these patterns looking at both human and physical characteristics of the places that we're examining. We want to know, is a city compact or sprawling? What factors contribute to that? Where do the boundaries between different nations lie, and what do they look like? And how can we explain that? From how far away do people come to trade in towns of different sizes? What factors can explain why people come to some towns from greater distances away than others? Place, this is about space and place. Place describes a site's physical characteristics, that is its topography or landforms, its climate, its resources, its vegetation, and also its human characteristics, economic activities, human settlement patterns, religion, language, land use. Culture is an important part in thinking about space and place. In fact, the geography section of Dimension 2 is really the only place, aside from the appendices for sociology and anthropology, where the concept of culture is mentioned in the C3 framework. So culture matters in a couple of ways. First of all, it plays a role in what human characteristics are present in place, but it also helps us understand how people value different physical characteristics. Now, maps are probably the best known as spatial representations of the world. In fact, geography has been called the art of the mappable. What can you put on a map? But really, mapping involves more than just what my colleague Bob Morrow refers to as target practice with maps. That is just place name identification. What is the capital of Slovenia? Questions like that. It's more than just memorizing those names of locations. What we want to do is we want to map data to reveal patterns that we wouldn't otherwise see. Now, when I work with my students and study international trade, I have them collect product labels from products around their home, and we put all that onto a chart and we graph it out. But you get a very different representation of that data when you map it, when you can see that certain regions and certain countries of the world, and the countries come out in the graph, but certain regions of the world may produce more of certain types of goods than others. So mapping things helps us understand the spatial patterns. Now, we have to understand maps that we use as opposed to ones that we make as documents. So like anything else, we have to look at the bias, the source, the perspective. Human-environment interaction. This is one place where geography is unique in bringing together the physical sciences and the humanities or social sciences by looking at the way that people interact with their environments here. You can help understand the past and future of human impacts on the environment by looking at the spatial distributions. Human population, migration, where do people move over time? This is clearly closely tied to history. What are some of the physical and human characteristics that have influencing? How did the physical characteristics of Africa influence human migration in Africa, or influence the diffusion of Islam from its birthplace on the Arabian Peninsula? And finally, we have global interconnections. And this really takes the previous category and moves it into the future. What is the likelihood of the distribution of certain plants or animal species or humans on the Earth going to be like over time in the future?
Great, thank you. And thank everybody for being here. I'm thrilled to be part of this, and I hope everybody can hear me okay because my microphone went on the kaputs right before we started the actual presentation. I'm going to open with a very brief anecdote. A couple years ago, I went to a 4th grade class, and I said, I am a historian, what do I do? And of course, one kid raised his hand, you know, pick me, pick me, pick me, and I said, yes. And he said, you clean. And I said, excuse me? And he said, you clean. And I thought for a moment, and I said, well, yeah, I do kind of clean.
Where do people move over time? This is clearly closely tied to history. What are some of the physical and human characteristics that have influencing? How did the physical characteristics of Africa influence human migration in Africa or influence the diffusion of Islam from its birthplace on the Arabian Peninsula? And finally, we have global interconnections. And this really takes the previous category and moves it into the future. What is the likelihood of the distribution of certain plants or animal species or humans on the Earth going to be like over time in the future?
Great, thank you. And thank everybody for being here. I'm thrilled to be part of this, and I hope everybody can hear me okay because my microphone went on the kaputs right before we started the actual presentation. I'm going to open with a very brief anecdote. A couple years ago, I went to a 4th grade class, and I said, I am a historian, what do I do? And of course, one kid raised his hand, you know, pick me, pick me, pick me, and I said, yes. And he said, you clean. And I said, excuse me? And he said, you clean. And I thought for a moment, and I said, well, yeah, I do kind of clean. I did, you know, co-founded an archive, and I had to remove all the metal and the staples and organize everything. And there was a process of cleaning that was involved. And as I started to call on other students, he started to giggle, and it was an infectious giggle, so I started to giggle. And then I asked him, I said, what are we giggling about? And he said, I thought you said you were a custodian, but you're a historian, and you still clean. And so one of the aspects that I realized is that I made his question relevant. And that's really what we're talking about, is the relevance and the significance and the importance of historical thinking and historical skills for college, career, and engaged citizenry. So these are skills that are far more than just historical knowledge or knowledge of content. So just to talk briefly about the goals in historical thinking is it's not about what happened when, which frequently that's what people think. It's about, you know, that I'm going to really be bound by dates. But to encourage informed citizens who are able to form compelling questions, to think historically, and to develop research skills, and to organize knowledge. That is what we're talking about. So it is about the who, what, where, when, and why that we all had to do when we were in college and writing those essays. But it's more about the skills and methods of historians to gather information from a wide array of sources and to ask questions of that evidence, whether it's documents, images, film, literature, material culture, and to consider the significance of the evidence and to form interpretations of the past that are relevant not only to understanding the past, but understanding the present. So historical thinking is a process of chronological reasoning that means grappling with things such as causality, connections, significance, and context to develop credible explanations of past events and based on reasonable interpretation of the evidence. So these skills are applicable to careers because every company has a history, every school has a history, every college or discipline has a history, and I'm not going to bore you with the history of my discipline, and your country as well as your citizenship has a history. So these are all really important skills. So in Dimension 2, obviously change, continuity, and context is the beginning of how we look at change over time and continuity. This is the basis of those compare and contrast between the past and the present or different historical periods, we always look for patterns of change, patterns of continuity, and how these are related to context. And context is about that who, what, where, when, and why. Perspective is more about the why. It is about the scale and the scope, which we've heard a lot mentioned. And there are multiple views of the past. So people have different attitudes, different beliefs, different ideas, and different backgrounds, and all those influence their approaches. So imagine if we only studied the Great Depression by looking at the writings of the elites or the Great Recession, and not looking at the evidence by those that was produced by those on the margins. The other thing that's important is perspective, that question of why, and looking at those different perspectives, it develops empathy. And empathy is something that is historically significant. It allows us to understand people in a particular time and place and why they take particular action. The other thing is about historical sources and evidence, and these are about the research skills. All disciplines and professions require these skills, and it's about gathering evidence. And as historians, we sift through lots of evidence, but we also interrogate the evidence. And who wrote it? Where is it from? Who produced it? The last aspect about causation and argumentation, this is the hardest part because it's a synthesis of the evidence, and it's also questioning things about the continuity and context and contingency, and also that history is not a description. It is an interpretation of an argument, and that's a little bit different than what frequently people think. This is a great article, by the way. It's a very basic, What Does It Mean to Think Historically, by Thomas Andrews and Flannery Burke. And you can actually see how this reproduces some of the things in the C3 framework. So the aspect of change, what we call the 5 C's, change over time, continuity, causality, complexity, and contingency. It's a basic article, students love it, and it's a great kind of cheat sheet for anyone as they're starting to teach. Here are a couple of my students who are actually involved in cleaning, historical cleaning. They were working at the 69th Street Regiment Armory in Manhattan, an uncatalogued and unorganized collection. And so these were really kind of basic skills that they were learning. And of course, this is about reading our own basic skills, like sourcing a document. How do you read a document? How do you think about who, what, where, when, and why? What is it telling you? And also ways to kind of do that as a group or an individual. Reading for clues. What are the questions that emerge? What is the importance of the document? Questions about the time, the place, and the scale. And the other thing that's really important is, what more do you need to know to really study that document? These students actually benefited from the cleaning that was done by other archivists, and some of them are at the end of the table, and they actually laid it out very nicely for them. And here we can see more complex questions about advanced historical thinking, the analysis of those contexts, how to look at competing and integrating factors. And the other thing is that historiography interpretation, that it's at these advanced levels that students start to recognize that historians have different perspectives and that those perspectives change over time, just on the basis of the evidence of where they were writing at the time frame they were writing. They too have their own attitudes, their own belief systems, and those influence their writing. And that's where students can kind of start to see how their interpretations might change over time. So there's lots of ways to kind of do this. And obviously many people look at, primary sources, the compelling questions, they model these skills for their students. They might use images and comics, which I think comics and images are great because they're basic, real early ways to kind of get students engaged in this. So what more do we need to know to understand who produced this comic, or who produced this image? Where is this image from? The other thing to make it relevant is the local, near, and the global. Near history is great. It makes it relevant to the students, but also adding global context. So for instance, how to kind of, as the schools become more diverse, how to bring that into the classroom. Working with embedded librarians is important, or media studies specialists who can help you with finding relevant material and good material. The other thing is partnerships with local universities, history departments, social studies departments, schools of ed, as well as the organizations that were involved in producing this, NCSS, the AHA, the AHA's tuning project, which demonstrates the expectations of over 100 historians for skills we expect from BA students. the National Council for History Education, the World History Association, their websites, their conferences, etc. Last, I just want to mention is that it's about student engagement. People love history. You know, there's a history channel. I know there's a National Geographic channel too, but they do a lot of history also, so I want to claim that as a historian. There's historical dramas and movies, and there are 3 million plus people running around this country, the United States, researching their family history, not their family psychology. So those are things to kind of keep in mind. People are interested. So the skills that are kind of laid out about reading for clues, developing big ideas, and analysis and presentation skills, it is about doing history, and these are what we do. And these are applicable to any discipline. And I think part of it is kind of being very upfront with students about why we're doing history or why we're doing geography or civics or all of these things, that these are building blocks about what you're going to do over and over again. So as historians, everything has a history, and it's how we study it, interpret it, and analyze it, and communicate the past to inform the present with insight ensures that the students will be able to evaluate sources and evidence and communicate those conclusions to take informed action, which we're also looking for. So that could be something such as doing a history presentation. It could be writing a letter to an editor, helping to organize a local history archive, learning how the legal system works, so maybe one day introducing a bill, or even how to clean whether multiple or figurative ways of historical artifacts. Look forward to any of your questions. So,
Thinking. I mean, I think especially in the elementary to middle school range, most of the really good informational texts that bear on civics are actually also history. You know, they're generally going to be narratives of social and civic participation and change. You know, stories about Rosa Parks or George Washington or many other figures. There's earlier grades, as far as I know, and others might jump in. But as far as I know, there's not really a very good supply of nonfiction texts that are well written and fun to read that are about processes abstractly. So, you know, we would like kids in civics to learn about rules and laws, about participation and processes in which people participate, and about institutions like the government. If you look at the K through 8 kind of reading range, and you look for not for textbooks, but for informational texts that are available in bookstore, there's few that will just abstractly deal with those questions that are any good. But there are lots of ways to use historical narrative about, let's say, the writing of the Declaration of Independence or the organizing of the Montgomery Bus Boycott that bring out those themes. Then at the high school level, of course, there's a lot more, because there you can draw on good texts of political science and law, particularly. But others might have suggestions. They should definitely type them in.
And if I might add from the geography perspective, this is the thing where you really do have to piece things together. There don't tend to be collected sets of documents as there are for certain history classes. A lot of the school-oriented magazines and readers for students that are pegged at different reading levels will have articles that can be used. Will have a geography component in that. So that's always a good place to start. Of course, it depends on what topic you're trying to address with that as well.
All right, thank you. Phil, I think we've got a economics question for you. Andrew asks, with economics and the K-12 framework, there isn't mention of the mathematics standards and concepts. Should we be mindful of those, or are we primarily concerned with rationalizing the results after the calculations to determine human behavior?
I'll take it just because in history we obviously are moving, as Peter mentioned, that civics is frequently under the umbrella of history, but also we employ geography and economic thinking within the historical profession, but also obviously in teaching classes. I mean, you're going to incorporate all of these areas in the social sciences and even broadly in humanities. So whether it's, if you're talking about history of religion, you're talking about philosophical thought, all of those aspects. So I think that we borrow and we share a lot of methodology, and we're constantly doing that.
And I'm pleased to hear that that is true at the college and university level, because certainly at the K-12 level, it would seem essential for us to do that. You can't have the differentiation that I would imagine you're able to have a little bit more of at the university and college level.